the beginning of the film, again, very elegantly, very succinctly, and only visually, we get the sort of an anthropologist tour of Immortan Joe's world. And this is a world that is built on like the opposite of basically John Paul II's culture of death. Like this is a world of instrumentalization. And so let's just go through it. One thing, the wives, the 5 wives that Furiosa rescues are at one point referred to as his prize breeders. And again, it's all implicit, but when you see, what is made clear when you see the crowd of people who are not the wives, plenty of women down there, but they're all kind of mutated and weird. And the thing these 5 wives have in common is that they're perfect. They're like they don't have screwed up genes from whatever nuclear fallout is going on. They are like sort of, pure and unsullied. And that is why Joe wants them to give him children. He's obsessed with the idea of having a son who's not like screwed up like his 2 sons that he does have. So he's using them as like baby incubators. They're not wives in any meaningful sense of the word wife. They're baby makers. Okay, right. Then he's got another room of women who are just milked. They are lactating, and he uses them as cows basically, and he's collecting milk from these women. They're not people to him. They're milk makers. Then there's the war boys, who are able-bodied young men and are useful as killing machines, and that's how he uses them. And so he's...
And there's the blood bags, the lowest on the totem pole, right?
That's right, yeah, which is how Max is captured, and they have a doctor with them who's wonderfully named the Organic Mechanic, which is perfect for a world where everything's built around cars. So what's a doctor? Well, he's like a mechanic that works on people, right? Right. So the Organic Mechanic identifies that Max is a type O blood, so he's a universal donor, which makes him a very prized object in the world of Immortan Joe. And so exactly as you say, he's used as an object as well.
Yeah, and there's this emphasis on the body from the very beginning. So we see Max being tattooed on the back with his basically his medical labels, O negative, universal donor. Then almost immediately we cut to our first introduction of Furiosa, and the first thing we see of her is the brand on the back of her neck, the Immortan Joe brand. And same with Nux, when we first encounter him, he's depleted, he's hooked up to a blood bag, just trying to get right again. And so there is this emphasis on the body, which is the sort of uniquely objectifiable element of a person, you know?
Yeah, the brand gets to the whole, it just encompasses the whole philosophy of Immortan Joe, which he says explicitly at some point, that's my child, that's my property, right? And that's his whole point of view. And when the girls, when the wives rebel and he bursts into the room where they've been living, what do they have written on the wall? Do you remember?
We are not things.
Exactly. And those are the 2 poles, the philosophical poles here. Are people, means that you can use for whatever end you want, or are they ends in themselves and subjects rather than objects? We are not things is their point of view. Another interesting connection to theology of the body, at least from my point of view, when the movie came out, I don't know if you recall, but a lot of the discussion about the film was saying it's a feminist action film, and I'm in some ways, like, I'll say this, the discourse was this is an anti-patriarchy, like Immortan Joe stands for whatever, the church, the government, like all these patriarchal supposedly institutions, and Furiosa is the feminist, like person that shatters that. And I think, like, actually in some ways it's true, but it's not deep enough, because yes, like she is a woman who is victorious over this bad society, and the society is patriarchal in the sense that Immortan Joe is in charge of it, but it's a false masculinity, right? And that's what we start to see. To me, the film wasn't so much feminist. It wasn't about a woman kicking ass. It was about the complementarity of Max and Furiosa.
Absolutely.
Well, this is the question that I came into this wanting to discuss, and it will work well with your theology of the body theme, is like, to what extent is this film a feminist message movie? To what extent does it complicate that?
Well, and I would say John Paul II in some ways could be described as a feminist. He spent a lot of his teaching talking about the sort of the mystery and the genius, the feminine genius, but one of the subjects is like the feminine identity is found in motherhood. And he says that even for women who never become biological mothers, but what's so great about Furiosa as a female action character is that she is a feminine action hero. Like her whole motivation, her whole plan is very feminine. It is not a woman doing a masculine action movie.
Exactly.
Like, and there's a lot of those.
Yeah.
You can see a lot of female action heroes whose power is that they're strong and they can beat people up. But Furiosa is rescuing women. She is being nurturing. I mean, like, and you know, I don't care if you think that I'm being stereotypical or whatever,
Sure.
you people of YouTube, but you know, but it's like we can talk about the role that the mother and the father play, and the role that the mother plays is nurturing and feeding the child, whereas the father plays a different role,
Yeah.
which is supportive of that. And Furiosa's mission is to rescue these women. Those women, their mission is to rescue their children for
Yeah.
their future.
And it's interesting because George Miller seems to actually address this head on at a certain point in the film when they finally reach the green place, which of course isn't very green, and it's where the many mothers live, but most of the mothers are gone now, and it's just sort of a remnant remaining. These old sort of battle-hardened women. One of them is talking about how she's killed every person she's ever met in this wasteland, and one of the young wives, who's sort of just getting to know these women, says something to the effect of, I thought you all would be above that somehow. And the older woman looks at her sort of quizzically. In her eyes, you can see that she's intuiting or understanding her meaning. And what does she do next? She says, come here, I'll show you something. She shows her the seeds that she's been carrying with her, the real heirlooms that she plants every chance she gets. So it's like, it's a response. It's maybe even like a rebuttal, but it's a confirmation of what that younger woman was intuiting, which is our role is different. We are above that, so to speak, you know? And I think that like, you know, this is a common criticism of you know, anybody who like begins to espouse like sexual difference is that like women get placed on a pedestal or whatever. But like, okay, they actually kind of are. like, and if we're going to talk about the Blessed Mother, like she is like our race's solitary boast, right? I think that women really shine forth in this film as being like above the sort of like petty squabbling and the violence and the struggle for survival that characterizes the men in this film.
Totally.
And not in a way that like necessarily denigrates men. Like I think that masculinity has its day in this film, you know? But when we first are introduced to the wives, what is it? We see Max sort of saddling up to the truck where they've stopped, and they're rinsing off in the water, and it's like this kind of like you've seen this before in a movie or something, you know, like it's kind of sexualized, it's kind of tastefully done, but they really do sort of like like you're bowled over by the beauty of these creatures in this sort of like wicked wasteland. And how is Max behaving? He can be described as like brutish and animalistic for most of this film, but I think that probably nowhere is that more clear than in this scene, where his whole interaction with them is through a series of gestures and grunts, you know, and if he says anything, it's like just one word, like water, you know, and he's the one who's bringing violence and bringing like aggression, you know, and to basically disrupt this otherwise idyllic, picturesque moment. So I do think that this is something that George Miller is interested in.
Can I throw in, there's another moment that I think where he hits that on the head as well, where when they get to the many mothers, the Vuvolini, which, you know, is sort of taking the name clearly from the vulva, you know, so that this is a women's society that to the exclusion of men. When they see two men getting off of Furiosa's war rig, they're nervous. And they're like, the men? And she's like, they helped us, you know. And so I think even the Vuvolini are broken in their own way, because they have seen like the vices of men and the vices of masculinity, and they've said, well, we don't want that as part of our culture. But Furiosa, who's grown up in a man's world, has also seen the virtues of men and is willing to trust Max and Nux, and so again, like the war party of Furiosa is the integration of masculinity and femininity.
I mean, you guys both said like a lot of things there that I want to comment on. One of which is first, because going back to a couple of things you said before about Nux, and I wish I could remember the name of the woman that the
redhead
is bonding with.
She's I wrote it down. I can't remember.
If we're talking about complementary and solidarity rather than division, I think it's interesting to note that I think the reason that she is able to sympathize with him is that she grew up in that society, and she probably has some kind of strange matriarchal fondness for these war boys. Mm-hmm. I mean, she probably has some kind of pity despite her disgust with that whole social order. I think she probably has some sympathy for their plight and is in a unique position to understand him, right. You know, and you were talking about people's bodies being used. And I think that there's also a solidarity between the men and the women in this film in that respect. I mean, despite
that they've been victims of
the biggest focus of the plot is on the women not being things and their rescue. But of course, Mad Max is being used as an object from the beginning of the film. He's every bit being used as a resource as they are. And of course, the war boys are being every bit used as objects as they are, as you pointed out. Now,
well, let me just jump on that because I think with the men, specifically with Nux and Max, they both kind of end the way they started, because Nux sacrifices himself for something, and Max gives his blood. But so like on some objective level, nothing changed. But what's different is that their freedom is now involved. Yeah. It's a self-gift.
And this is perhaps like the most Catholic aspect of the movie, because a lot of people, let's take the debate over, among Christians over like obedience in marriage, right? Like a lot of people would say, well, like, oh no, obedience is inherently like degrading and unequal. But like, there's such a huge difference between like in any situation, not just marriage, there's such a huge difference between being made into a slave and like choosing, like obedience is the ultimate act of freedom, which is, I think, what John Paul II would think, the ultimate act of freely giving yourself, and like the ultimate actualization of the human capacity for freedom, right?
There's this idea,
and so these things, like I was saying, with the values of his society being put to some good with Nux, it's the same with Max, as you point out. It's the same physical thing, but the dynamic is different, and the meaning of it is different. So rather than George Miller saying, well, liberation comes when you just reject that idea of serving anybody but yourself at all. And, I'm so traumatized by this, being used to give blood that I just have to go and, do self-care and live for myself now. He's going back to the same wheelhouse, but it's been totally redeemed and transformed in that way.
Right. So it gets to a really key theology of the body concept, which is the nuptial meaning of the body, which is a phrase probably you guys have come across and everything. Yeah. And so it means, nuptials is when people marry, and John Paul means it in that sense, as well as a deeper sense too. But in that sense, what it means is in a way, like the male genitalia do not make sense unless there are also female genitalia out there. And what that means is that you can read the body and see that the body is there to be given as a gift to another. The body is incomplete on its own. And he really interestingly points out that the first sign of something not being right in Genesis is when God sees that Adam is alone and sees that that's not good. Everything up to this point has been good, but Adam's original solitude is not good. And in that, for that reason, he has to make him a helper, one of flesh of my flesh, blood of my blood, etc. But the deeper sense of the nuptial meaning of the body is just simply that the body is there so that we subjects can make a gift of ourselves to each other. And in this sense, it's quite striking to think about the fact that any interaction my soul can have with your soul, or the souls of the people listening to us, is, in the words of one of my favorite science fiction stories, only accomplished because I'm squeezing air through my meat. Like the articulation of my inner thoughts into words that you can understand is through this physical medium of my body. And it's true about the sacraments as well, that all of the sacraments have that physical embodied component. You put the Eucharist on your tongue, the priest speaks the words of absolution with his meat. He squeezes air through his meat in order to forgive your spiritual sins. It's kind of amazing. So the sacraments are maybe it's kind of the biggest exemplar of the nuptial meaning of the body, in the sense that the body is used to administer the grace of God. But it's true in all human interactions that we use our bodies, even if it's just simply speech or the look between someone's eyes. We use our bodies in order to make ourselves a gift to each other. And the films focus on the body as a medium of gift
rather than on dialogue.
Right.
Yeah.
Is very much in line with that.
Yeah. So a couple other things I wanted to go back to is like, okay, so, I mean, you could look at this as clearly somewhat intentionally a feminist movie. I'm not a feminist, so like that potentially poses a problem for me, right? So, but I do see that it complicates it in various ways. I mean, you already pointed that out with the many mothers to a certain extent, but like, okay, George Miller, he hires I think Eve Ensler is her name, the author of the Vagina Monologues, as a consultant, as a script consultant on this film. So like, there's a clear like feminist genealogy, right? But and then you've got that word breeders. It's like, yes, in the context of this film, obviously that's wrong, but it can't help for a pro-life Catholic call to mind the sorts of slurs that are cast at pro-life people. You think that women are just for breeding and, handmaids.
But
and
isn't
all
it
that
fair
kind
to
of
say
stuff.
that if that's what Catholics thought, it would be wrong?
Yes,
You know what I
that's
mean?
what I'm
Yeah.
saying. But it still feels like it can bring forth those connotations,
Yeah.
right? Of like
It's
an
open
unfair,
to that interpretation. It's open
Yes.
to like a certain cheerleader. Yes.
This is
Yeah.
one of the things that disappointed me the most about how this film was originally received, was as being this sort of like feminist anthem or something, but that really like flatlines the film and like robs it of a lot of its complexity. I remember getting into an argument with a priest friend about this because he just was completely dismissive of this movie because he just didn't want to see another movie where like men were muzzled and thrown on the front of a car and that like the woman saves the day,
Right.
you know? But like the thing is,
What are the other movies like?
no, but like I bring that up as an example of how this film was bandied about. It was
Right,
like,
right,
oh
right.
yeah, Mad Max is like no, totally helpless.
So
And,
it's like you're saying like people on the left were like, yeah, this is like a leftist screen,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
then people
they
on the
actually-
right were like, I'm not interested because it's leftist, and it's
I
like
remember,
you guys are missing it.
I remember some people actually like celebrating the fact that the main character is within the first moments of the film captured and like
Bound.
and muzzled, you know,
Right.
and so it, like in this era of like mansplaining or whatever, it's like so refreshing to see like Mad Max, like, but that I don't think that that's really what's going on there.
It's
know?
only
Like,
if you take that as like just an isolated image. That,
exactly.
yeah. But so, okay, the other big thing, the big thing at the beginning is like, who killed the world, right? And then that's said by a character later. You know, there's this back and forth between Nux and one of the wives, and Nux says, you're killing everyone and everything. Nux says, we're not to blame. Then who killed the world? And then she kicks him out of the car. Who killed the world? That's obviously like a very like facile thing in a sense, but you know, looking at it in terms of the battle of the sexes, who's probably in charge of the war efforts and the things that destroyed the world? Probably mostly men.
Is that how
Right.
you interpret that exchange? I always thought that this was a discussion about like people's, just humanity's role in the destruction
Yes.
of the environment.
That's interesting.
Not men.
I always took it as men, and that's why they're going off to the many mothers, and it's a society of all women. Now the film complicates this, so I'm not saying that the film is totally endorsing this,
Right.
but I think that the framework that's set up, who killed the world, this patriarchal, militaristic society, and then we're going to go to the green place with the many mothers in this nurturing place. So from the very beginning, it's not the type of feminism that is girl boss or women are just totally imitating men, but there is a kind of like, perhaps like 1970s, lesbian folk music aspect to it, where like, we don't need men, we're going to go make this nurturing society. And then what do we see? I've killed every person I've met out here. I thought you girls were above that somehow. And it shows you that like, okay, like, well, to paraphrase whoever said that, if God didn't exist, we'd have to invent him. If men didn't exist, we'd have to invent them, because somebody needs to be the protector in a hard and fallen world. It's clear that like, well, okay, if you don't have any men in this society, then women are just going to end up being, as you say, broken by having to.
Yeah.
You know, so that's the biggest complicating scene, as you pointed out.
Yeah, and the green place too is spoiled. You know that
Yes.
the
Not that
ground-
it's their fault per se, but yeah.
Going back to that exchange, I always thought, because I mean, I think you might be right. Or put it this way: the text doesn't tell us, and we could ask George Miller what he thinks, but in a way, who cares, right? Because if that exchange, if we read it the other way, which is when Nux says we're not to blame, he means we people are not to blame. What I glean from that is that that's part of the gospel of Immortan Joe. The world is broken, but we are not to blame. It's not your fault, you know. And so I think he's preaching a certain
So Knox is saying we're
sin.
not to blame, inclusive of the women
everyone.
the woman he's talking
right,
to.
and she's saying she's trying to puncture his myth